The most boring food in your kitchen was invented as part of a doctor's moral campaign against stimulation. In the 1890s, a respected Michigan doctor set out to design a breakfast cereal so bland, so deliberately unstimulating, that it would calm the body and quiet what he called the passions. His name was John Harvey Kellogg, and he ran a famous sanitarium where the rich and the famous went to be cured of fatigue, indigestion, and anything else a Victorian gentleman preferred to blame on desire. The cornflake was born in that kitchen, on purpose, for that reason. What his own brother did with the recipe is the part no one tells. Battle Creek, Michigan, in the 1880s was not the kind of place where you expected to find the future of breakfast. It was a quiet town with a white clapboard hotel that had been converted into something stranger. A sanitarium, run by a young Seventh-day Adventist surgeon named John Harvey Kellogg, that promised to cure its wealthy guests of almost anything that ailed them: insomnia, dyspepsia, and fatigue. The condition the Victorians called nervousness, which is to say, the entire interior weather of the modern self. Kellogg had renamed the place the Battle Creek Sanitarium, but everyone in town shortened it to one word: the San. Inside, the corridors gleamed with white paint and electric light. Hydrotherapy baths, vibration chairs, electric light baths, yogurt enemas, and a strict vegetarian diet composed almost entirely of grains. The guest list included Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and Amelia Earhart. At any hour, a young John Harvey could be found circling the grounds in a long white coat, prescribing, exhorting, monitoring. The San had roughly 1,000 patients in residence at peak season and a staff that never numbered less than 800, and they paid handsomely for the privilege of being told what to eat. Kellogg was an Adventist, which meant he inherited a theology that fused body and soul into a single machine. What you ate, what you drank, what you felt, what you desired, these were not private matters. They were levers, and Kellogg spent his entire career adjusting them. He laid the theory out in a book first published in 1879, running to 512 pages in early editions, and later expanded, titled Plain Facts for Old and Young, embracing the natural history and hygiene of organic life. The book's central argument, in plain language, was that stimulating food made stimulating people. Flavor, seasoning, meat, stimulants of every kind, coffee, tea, alcohol. These inflamed what Kellogg called the passions. The opposite calmed them. Grains, nuts, plain bread, boring food. He was not the first American to think this way. One generation earlier, a Presbyterian minister named Sylvester Graham had walked the same road, preaching that meat and spices lit a fire inside the body that had to be extinguished before it consumed the soul. Graham is why you have graham crackers. He is the earlier claimant in a tradition that runs through the Kellogg's and out into the cereal aisle. Blandness in this worldview was not a marketing accident. It was a moral instrument. He was also not the first American doctor to invent a cereal. In 1863, 31 years before the Kellogg's boiled a pot of wheat, a physician named James Caleb Jackson up in Dansville, New York, had already invented granula. It was a baked, unsweetened, rock-hard brick of bran and grain that had to be soaked overnight in milk before a human jaw could make any impression on it. It tasted, by every account, like wet sawdust. It was also a deliberate construction. Bland, fibrous, instrumental, designed for the same body as machine logic that Kellogg would later inherit. Granula did not survive. It is a footnote today. But it establishes something important. The cornflake is not a clean invention by a single mind. It sits on top of a 30-year-old tradition of doctor-designed breakfast foods built to be dull on purpose. Then, in 1894, in the basement kitchen of the San, John Harvey Kellogg and his wife Ella were running experiments on wheat dough for their vegetarian patients, most of whom suffered chronic indigestion. A pot of boiled wheat was left out overnight. By morning, it had gone stale and rubbery. Rather than throw it out, the kitchen staff rolled it thin and toasted it. The result was a flake, light, crisp, bland, and, because of the toasting, digestible. They called it granos, and it became the first flaked cereal in the world. John Harvey filed a patent for the flaking process in 1895. The patent covered wheat, barley, oats, corn, and other grains. A cornflake variant was added to the Sans offerings a few years later. By 1905, the Sans food business, branded Sanitas, was producing around 150 cases a day, a small but respectable commercial operation serving the doctor's moral vision. This is the version most people half remember. A doctor invents a cereal, his brother commercializes it, a wholesome health food is born. The literal claim floating around the internet is sharper, that cornflakes were invented specifically to stop masturbation. But the careful historians at Snopes, working with the University of Michigan's Howard Markle, the definitive Kellogg biographer, rate that literal claim mostly false. The food was never marketed that way. What is true, and what the marketing version deliberately leaves out, is that the blandness was the point. The dullness was the design. Will Keith Kellogg was 8 years younger than John Harvey. He had worked at the San for years, mostly in the background, doing whatever John needed, managing the books, running experiments, troubleshooting machinery. Inside the institution, he was sometimes described, with only faint affection, as J.H.'s flunky. The brothers were opposites. John Harvey was the surgeon, the theorist, the man who edited a health magazine for nearly 70 years and wrote nearly 50 books and held strange views about almost everything. Will was the operator. He understood machines, supply chains, customers. In the late 1890s, John Harvey traveled abroad for one of his long lectures. While he was gone, Will ran the kitchen, and Will did something that was, in the moral economy of the San, almost a sin. He added sugar to the recipe. It was not technically a small change. Inside the San, sugar was treated the way a modern nutritionist treats a cigarette. Sweetness was stimulation. Stimulation was, in John's framework, the engine of every appetite the doctor had spent his life trying to quiet. Adding sugar to the cornflake was not a tweak. It was an act of theological sabotage. When John Harvey returned, he was furious. He condemned the new flavor. He ordered Will to personally pay for the new food processing plant Will had quietly built during his brother's absence. The San rebuilt itself after a devastating fire in 1902. Will helped. Then, in February 1906, just before his 46th birthday, he walked out. He founded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company with a partner named Charles D. Bolin, hired a small staff, and put sugar, malt, and salt into the recipe. Not a lot, enough. This is the inversion the story pivots on. The doctor had spent his life building an instrument of suppression, a breakfast food so unstimulating that no one would crave it, no one would overeat it, no one would attach pleasure to it. His brother took the same recipe, in the same town, in the same family kitchen, and turned it into the opposite thing. A food sold because it was desirable, a food sold because you wanted more of it. The recipe had not changed. The premise had. The town had already started to vibrate. C.W. Post, a chronic invalid who had come to the San as a patient in the early 1890s, left inspired and built his own empire in 1895 with a coffee substitute called Postum. By 1900, his company was doing $3 million a year. He followed it with grape nuts in 1897 and Post Toasties a few years later. John Harvey accused Post of stealing his ideas. The two men detested each other for decades. The Post-Kellogg feud was one of the great commercial rivalries of the era, made uglier by the fact that it had started in the same place. Post had been a real patient at the San, paying for treatment, eating the bland food, walking the San's corridors. He came out convinced that the whole enterprise was a fortune waiting to be hijacked. He had watched the operations from the inside. He had tasted the cereal. He had the formula in his head, or at least he believed he did. What he built was not a copy. Postum was a roasted cereal-based coffee substitute, dark and bitter, marketed as a cure for nervous dyspepsia. Grape Nuts was a denser, harder cereal that promised to cure indigestion if eaten slowly enough. Post Toasties were the closest thing to Kellogg's Corn Flakes on the market, sold in a yellow box that competed directly with Will's red box on grocery shelves across the country. The products were different. The market was the same. The two men traded lawsuits through the early 1900s. Post publicly accused Kellogg of running a fraud. Kellogg countersued for libel. They placed competing full-page advertisements in the same newspapers. They gave speeches denouncing each other in the same Midwestern towns. By the time Post died in 1914, he had made a fortune, and he had spent a good portion of it trying to destroy the man who had treated him at the Sander Battle Creek, by then, had gone daft over cereal. By the boom years, more than 40 different cereal companies had launched in Battle Creek. One observer in 1902 wrote that everyone in town has gone daft over food cereal business. Battle Creek earned the nickname the cereal capital of the world. Almost every one of those companies collapsed. Will's outlasted them. But the company that survived did not have an easy childhood. Will's marketing was aggressive in a way the doctor would have considered obscene. The Sun had sold cereal by mail and at the Sun's own storefront, on the assumption that the food would speak for itself. Will understood a different economy. He understood that a food you did not already want had to be sold into wanting. In 1907, he ran a campaign, later known as Wink Wednesday, that urged New York housewives to wink at their grocer on Wednesdays in exchange for a free box of cornflakes. The campaign was so successful that grocers in Manhattan started setting out boxes on the counter just to see what would happen. Within months, those grocers were reordering by the case, then by the truckload. New York City sales multiplied 15 times over. Will backed the campaign with something the cereal industry had never seen before: a sustained national advertising budget. He placed full-page color advertisements in women's magazines. He produced coupon drops. He stamped the Kellogg's name onto every box, every carton, every wooden case that left the Battle Creek plant. By 1909, the company was producing 100,000 cases a day, and the brand had become a household name across the country. The cereal designed to make people indifferent to breakfast was now being sold with the full force of appetite, identity, and brand desire. Will's advertising innovations went beyond the Wink campaign. He pioneered the use of full-color magazine advertising for breakfast cereals, a strategy that few food manufacturers could afford. He commissioned testimonials from doctors, dietitians, and mothers. He ran grocery store display contests that turned ordinary retailers into willing salespeople. He understood, decades before the rest of the industry caught up, that a cereal bought out of habit was worth more than a cereal bought out of hunger. The cereal industry that emerged from Battle Creek during those boom years became the template for processed American food for the next century. The recipe was simple. Take a cheap grain, toast it, add sugar, brand it, and advertise it until the consumer forgot that breakfast had ever been anything else. By the 1920s, the American pantry had been remade. Where there had been bacon and eggs, toast and coffee, oatmeal and fruit, there was now a box of cereal that promised to be more convenient, more modern, and more complete than anything the previous generation had eaten. The doctor's insistence on blandness had been the starting point. The brothers' insistence on branding had been the engine. The American breakfast, as it existed for the rest of the 20th century, was the joint invention of both. Then came the family war over the name. In 1908, John Harvey renamed his Sanitarium business the Kellogg Food Company and began selling cornflakes in packaging almost identical to his brothers. Lawsuits were filed in 1910 by both brothers over the Kellogg name. In 1911, the brothers reached an out-of-court settlement that gave WK control of the Kellogg's trademark. A second phase of litigation, including John Harvey's appeal, ran from 1916 until the Michigan Supreme Court ruled decisively in WK's favor in 1920, granting him exclusive rights to the Kellogg's name in the United States. The company renamed itself the Kellogg Cereal Company in 1922. The brothers did not speak. In September of 1941, John Harvey, then 89, wrote a letter to his brother. A reconciliation by all accounts. The letter was not delivered. Will did not attend John's funeral in 1943. The letter was finally passed to Will in 1948, when he was nearly blind and near the end of his own life. He died in 1951. The two brothers never reconciled in person. Two versions of this story circulate today, and both are wrong in opposite ways. The viral version that John Harvey Kellogg invented cornflakes specifically to stop people from masturbating is dramatic, shareable, and almost entirely false. Snopes and Markell, the Michigan medical historian, reviewed the record and ruled the literal claim mostly false. Cereal was not advertised or marketed as an anti-sex breakfast. The primary documented motivation was digestive health for sanitarium patients with chronic indigestion. But the moral framework behind it was real. The blandness was not a marketing accident, it was a design specification. The doctor believed in print, on hundreds of pages, that flavorful food inflamed the body, and that bland food calmed it. The viral version gets the spirit of the project right, and every specific detail wrong. The branded version, that a kindly doctor invented a wholesome breakfast food and his brother turned it into a business, is the one the Kellogg Company prefers. It is clean, inspiring, and true in the way company histories are true. It also erases the inversion. It erases that the brother commercialized exactly what the doctor designed against. It erases that sugar was added on purpose. It erases the lawsuits, the decades of silence, the undelivered letter. Both versions refuse to admit the obvious. The food designed to make you not want anything became the food sold because you want it. The earlier story is too grotesque to believe. The later story is too comforting. The honest version, that the crusade against appetite built an empire of appetite, and that the most successful sabotage of a Victorian moralist's life work was carried out by his own brother in his own kitchen with his own recipe, is the one nobody seems to want. The inversion is not a metaphor. The cornflake on your breakfast table this morning was designed by a doctor who wanted you to feel nothing toward it. His brother turned it into something you reach for. The doctor built an instrument of suppression. The brother turned it into a desire machine. The crusade against pleasure, repeated faithfully enough, eventually produced the most recognizable package of pleasure in the American pantry. The cleanest way to destroy a moral crusade is to commercialize it. So next time you open a cereal box, ask yourself, how many things in your kitchen were built to make you want them less before somebody figured out how to make you want them more? If stories like this one are why you subscribe, consider sticking around. There is a new origin every week.